Concrete scraped against worn rubber. A panicked scream cut through the subway's roar. Anthony didn't want to be a hero. He was $20 short on rent and running late to pick up his 6-year-old. But when the woman's wheelchair locked its wheels on the yellow platform edge, gravity didn't care about his problems. He jumped. It wasn't glorious. It was bruised ribs, torn fingernails, and the heavy smell of exhaust. He thought he was saving a broken stranger. He had no idea she owned the city. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly, flickering pallor over the West 4th Street station. Anthony Bowen stood near the cracked tile pillars, his shoulders slumped beneath the weight of a damp thrift store wool coat that smelled faintly of fried onions and stale grease from his second job at the diner. He rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand, feeling the grit of a 14-hour workday embedded in his skin. His knuckles were raw, the skin split from washing endless stacks of ceramic plates in scalding water. All he wanted was a cheap beer and sleep. Mostly sleep. And he needed to get to Mrs. Higgins's apartment before she charged him another $10 for keeping Cherish past 6 o'clock. $10 he absolutely did not have. The platform was surprisingly sparse for a Tuesday evening. A few stragglers huddled near the heated vents, eyes glued to their phones. Anthony kept his gaze fixed on the black, cavernous tunnel, waiting for the dual headlights of the downtown local. A low rumble began to vibrate through the soles of his worn work boots, a familiar mechanical heartbeat that rattled his teeth. Then a sharp, metallic screech snapped his attention sideways. 10 yards down the platform, a woman in a mechanized wheelchair was fighting a losing battle against the uneven concrete. She was positioned far too close to the tactile yellow warning strip. One of the front caster wheels had wedged itself violently into a deep, jagged fissure between the platform tiles. The sudden halt had pitched the chair forward at a precarious angle. Anthony watched his brain moving sluggishly through the exhaustion. He saw her pale hands gripping the joystick aggressively trying to reverse. The motor whined a high, stressed pitch, but the wheel was trapped. She jerked her upper body back, trying to shift the center of gravity. It was a mistake. The abrupt motion threw the heavy chair off balance. The back wheels lifted a fraction of an inch. The chair teetered. The rumble in the floor shifted into a roar. A blast of hot, foul air pushed out from the tunnel, carrying the smell of ozone rat droppings and rust. The train was seconds away. "Don't do it," an ugly survivalist voice whispered in Anthony's head. "It's not your problem. You can't afford an injury. Cherish needs you." He didn't make a conscious, heroic decision. It was muscle memory, a raw animal flinch against the sight of impending death. He dropped his cheap canvas duffel bag. Anthony bolted. His boots slapped against the grimy tiles. The train's horn blasted a deafening shriek that reverberated off the low ceilings. The woman in the chair twisted her head, her eyes wide, reflecting the blinding glare of the oncoming headlights. She wasn't screaming. She was completely, utterly silent, her mouth open in a soundless gasp of pure terror. He didn't try to pull the chair. There wasn't time. Anthony threw his entire body weight forward, tackling her around the waist. It was a violent, clumsy collision. His shoulder slammed into the hard plastic of the armrest, pain flaring white-hot down his collarbone. He grabbed handfuls of fabric, something impossibly soft, like silk or fine wool, and yanked backward with every ounce of desperate strength he possessed. They went down hard. Anthony hit the concrete floor first, absorbing the brunt of the impact. The air rushed out of his lungs in a sharp hiss. The woman landed heavily on top of him, an elbow driving sharply into his sternum. A millisecond later, the train roared past them. The wall of displaced air whipped violently over them, carrying a blizzard of grit and trash. The deafening squeal of iron on iron drowned out everything else. A loud, sickening crunch echoed above the din as the train clipped the front of the overturned wheelchair, sending a shower of sparks raining down onto the platform and spinning the heavy machine like a discarded toy. Anthony lay there gasping like a landed fish. His ribs throbbed with a dull, agonizing rhythm. Dust coated his tongue. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the train to pass, waiting for the adrenaline to recede so he could assess just how badly he had broken his own body. He had saved her. But as the roar of the train began to slow, replaced by the screeching of air brakes, Anthony realized the nightmare wasn't over. The woman on top of him was convulsing. Anthony shoved himself up onto his elbows, grunting as a sharp pain lanced through his right shoulder. He roughly shifted the woman off his chest, rolling her onto her back on the filthy platform tiles. "Hey," Anthony rasped, his voice raw. "Hey, lady, are you—" He stopped. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes, a striking pale hazel, were rolled back, showing too much white. Her mouth was open, pulling in shallow, desperate sips of air that sounded like torn paper. Now that they weren't moving, Anthony could see her clearly. She didn't look like anyone who belonged on this decaying subway platform. Her coat was a pristine, camel-colored cashmere, now smeared with dark grease and subway soot. The blouse, underneath which he had nearly torn off her shoulder, was cream silk. Her dark hair was pinned back elegantly, though a few strands had escaped and plastered themselves to her forehead. Slick with a sudden, unnatural sheen of sweat. But it was her skin that terrified him. It was grey, a terrible ashen colour, with a faint bluish tint creeping around her lips. "Help!" Anthony yelled, looking around wildly. The few stragglers on the platform had frozen, staring in shock at the mangled wheelchair and the two figures on the ground. "Somebody call an ambulance now." He looked back down at her. She was choking. No, not choking, she was having some kind of severe attack. Her hands, pale and manicured, clutched at her throat, the fingers curled inward like claws. Anthony's heart hammered against his ribs. He wasn't a medic. He was a dishwasher and a struggling father. He didn't know what to do. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded his veins. "Look at me," he commanded, slapping her cheek lightly. It felt wrong touching this woman who clearly belonged in a different stratosphere, but he did it again harder. "Hey, keep your eyes on me. What is it, asthma heart?" She couldn't answer. A horrifying wet rattle sounded deep in her chest. Anthony's eyes darted around. Her bag. A small, structured leather handbag had spilled open nearby when the chair tipped over. He scrambled toward it on his knees, ignoring the sharp sting of grit grinding into his skin. He dumped the contents onto the floor. A gold compact clattered against the tiles, a thick leather wallet, a set of heavy keys, and a small, bright orange plastic tube. EpiPen. Allergic reaction. Anthony muttered, grabbing the tube. His hands were shaking violently. He had seen an instructional video years ago when Cherish started kindergarten just in case. But watching a cartoon animation and jamming a needle into a dying woman's thigh were two very different things. He ripped the blue safety cap off. "This is gonna suck," he told her, his voice cracking. He didn't bother trying to be gentle. He gripped the tube in his fist, found a meaty spot on her outer thigh, right through her expensive tailored slacks, and slammed it down. Click. He held it there. 1, 2, 3, 4. He counted to 10 in his head, his own breathing ragged, mirroring her struggle. He pulled the injector away. A tiny drop of blood welled up on the dark fabric of her pants. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The woman's chest hitched. Her eyes squeezed shut. tears leaking from the corners, cutting clean tracks through the soot on her face. Then she took a breath. It was a loud, jagged, horrific sound, like a drowning victim breaking the surface of the water. She sucked in oxygen with such force that her entire body arched off the floor. Anthony slumped back onto his heels, running a trembling hand through his thinning, dusty hair. He exhaled a long, shaky breath, feeling the cold sweat trickling down his own spine. He watched her chest rise and fall, the rhythm uneven, but undeniably there. The blue tint around her mouth was already beginning to fade, replaced by a flushed, angry red. She turned her head slightly, her hazel eyes focusing on him for the first time. They were clouded with pain, confusion, and a lingering terror. She looked at his face, at his stained, cheap coat, at the grime under his fingernails. She tried to speak her voice, a cracked, dry whisper. "My chair." Anthony looked over his shoulder. The heavy motorized wheelchair was an unrecognizable heap of twisted metal, cracked plastic, and exposed wires lying inches from the edge of the platform. "Chair's dead lady." Anthony said, his tone flat the adrenaline crash, making him instantly irritable. He rubbed his aching shoulder. "You're not. Let's call it a win." He heard the distant wail of sirens echoing down the subway stairwell. Good. He had done his part. He had played the hero, nearly gotten himself killed, and ruined his only winter coat. The metallic smell of the tracks was making him nauseous, and the sharp pain in his ribs promised a week of misery. He glanced at his cheap digital watch. 6:45 p.m. "Damn it," Anthony hissed. Mrs. Higgins was going to kill him, and Cherish would be sitting by the door, swinging her legs, wondering why her dad was always late. He looked back at the woman. She was shivering now, a deep, violent tremor that shook her entire frame. She looked incredibly fragile, stripped of whatever power that expensive coat usually afforded her. A part of him, the soft part he tried so hard to bury, wanted to take off his coat and drape it over her, but his coat smelled like fryer grease. And she was a rich woman from a world he didn't understand. The police would be here in seconds. They would want statements. They would want ID. They would hold him for hours. He didn't have hours. He didn't have the luxury of time or the money for a hospital visit if they decided he needed checking out. Anthony stood up, his joints popping in protest. He grabbed his canvas duffel from where he'd dropped it. "Paramedics are coming," Anthony said, looking down at her. He felt a stab of guilt, sharp and ugly, but he pushed it down. "Just lay still. You're going to be fine." She reached out her fingers, weakly grasping at the air, trying to catch the hem of his jeans. "Wait, who?" Anthony stepped back out of her reach. He didn't offer his name. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the gathering crowd of onlookers, just as the first two police officers came sprinting down the stairs. The December wind slapped Anthony in the face the moment he pushed through the heavy glass doors of the subway station and stepped onto the street. He welcomed the bite of the cold. It helped clear the cloying smell of ozone and burnt hair from his nostrils. He pulled the collar of his ruined coat up around his neck, shivering violently, as the sweat cooling on his skin turned to ice. He walked fast, keeping his head down. Every step jarred his right knee, and his shoulder felt like it had been hit with a baseball bat. He mentally tallied the damage as he moved blocks away from the flashing red and blue lights converging on the station. Ribs bruised, hopefully not cracked. Coat ripped at the seams, stained with soot and a tiny speck of blood. Time 45 minutes late. He turned down a narrow, dimly lit street, lined with towering brick apartment buildings. The sidewalks here were cracked and uneven, littered with overflowing trash cans and damp, discarded flyers. This was his reality, not the pristine cashmere and gold compacts of the woman he had just left behind, but the smell of rotting cabbage and the constant grinding anxiety of survival. He shoved his hands deep into his pockets, his fingers brushing against a few loose quarters and a crinkled dollar bill. He tried to stop thinking about her. He had done the right thing. He had saved a life. But instead of feeling a warm glow of pride, he just felt empty and tired. So incredibly tired. Anthony stopped in front of a heavy metal door covered in graffiti. He punched in a worn 4-digit code and pushed his weight against it. It yielded with a loud metallic groan. The hallway smelled like old cooking oil and wet dog. He trudged up 3 flights of stairs, the pain in his knee growing sharper with every step. He reached apartment 4B and knocked twice. The door opened almost immediately, revealing a stout, older woman in a faded floral housecoat. Mrs. Higgins glared at him over the top of her wire-rimmed glasses. "You're late, Anthony," she snapped, her voice tight with annoyance. 48 minutes late. I missed my bingo game." "I know, Mrs. Higgins. I'm sorry." Anthony said, his voice flat. He didn't have the energy to argue. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $10 bill, his tip money from the diner. He handed it to her. "Here." She snatched the bill, her expression softening only slightly. "You look terrible. You smell like a chimney." "Subway delay," Anthony muttered, peering past her into the living room. "Is she—" "Daddy." A small missile of energy launched itself from the worn plaid sofa. Cherish, wearing mismatched socks and a faded denim jumper, slammed into Anthony's legs. He flinched as she hit his bruised ribs, but he quickly dropped to one knee, wrapping his arms around her small, warm body. "Hey, monkey," he whispered, burying his face in her messy brown curls. She smelled like cheap apple shampoo and crayons. It was the best smell in the world. It was the only thing that kept him going. "You're late," Cherish murmured against his neck, though there was no reproach in her voice, only relief. "I know. Daddy had a little trouble with the train. You ready to go home?" He stood up, groaning softly, and took her small hand in his rough, calloused one. After thanking Mrs. Higgins again, he led Cherish down the hall to their own apartment, right at the end of the corridor. It was a studio, barely 400 square feet. The paint was peeling around the window frame, and the radiator hissed a constant, annoying tune. But it was clean. Anthony spent his rare days off-scrubbing every surface, determined not to let the grime of the city touch his daughter. He locked the deadbolt behind them. Cherish immediately ran to her small corner, sectioned off by a faded curtain, and pulled out a battered coloring book. Anthony walked into the tiny kitchenette. He filled a glass of water from the tap and drank it down in one long gulp. His hands were still shaking. He took off his coat and threw it over the back of a wobbly dining chair. The overhead light caught the massive rip near the shoulder. He ran his thumb over the torn fabric. He couldn't afford to replace it. He would have to patch it with whatever thread he could find. He walked into the tiny bathroom and flipped on the harsh fluorescent light. He stared at his reflection in the stained mirror. He looked old. He was only 32, but the lines around his eyes and mouth belonged to a man 10 years older. There was a dark smudge of grease across his cheekbone, and a purple bruise was already beginning to bloom along his jawline from where he had hit the platform. He turned on the faucet and splashed cold water on his face, scrubbing away the dirt. Who was she? The thought intruded unbidden. He pictured the woman again, the sheer terror in those hazel eyes, the way she had grasped at his jeans as he walked away. She had been totally helpless. For a brief, terrifying moment, their lives had been completely tangled together on that filthy floor. Anthony turned off the tap and dried his face with a rough towel. It didn't matter. She was safe, likely sitting in a sterile private hospital room surrounded by doctors. And he was here in a freezing apartment trying to figure out how to stretch a box of macaroni and cheese into 2 meals. He walked back out to the main room. Cherish was humming to herself, meticulously coloring a purple dragon. Anthony sat down on the edge of the lumpy mattress that served as his bed. He pulled off his heavy boots, sighing as the pressure released from his aching feet. Tomorrow he had to be up at 5 a.m. for his shift at the warehouse. The world wouldn't stop spinning just because he had pulled a stranger off the subway tracks. He didn't know that miles away in a penthouse suite overlooking Central Park, a frantic team of security personnel was reviewing blurry transit footage, trying to identify the man in the torn coat. He didn't know that the woman he had saved wasn't just a rich stranger, but Cassandra Pierce, the fiercely private, cutthroat CEO of Pierce Industries. And he certainly had no idea that by leaving her on that platform, he hadn't escaped her world. He had just given her a reason to find him. Harsh electronic buzzing shattered the silence. 4:30 a.m. Anthony slapped the plastic alarm clock, sending it skittering off the milk crate beside his mattress. He lay there in the dark, the hiss of the radiator, the only other sound in the room. He took a shallow breath. Fire flared in his right side. It wasn't a dull ache. It was a sharp, grating sensation, as if the bones were grinding together like unoiled gears. He gritted his teeth and forced himself to sit up. The cold air of the apartment bit into his bare shoulders. He pulled his t-shirt over his head, wincing as he caught a glimpse of his rib cage in the dim street lamplight filtering through the blinds. A massive mottled canvas of deep purple and sickly yellow stretched from his armpit to his hip. He had crudely stitched the tear in his winter coat with heavy-duty black thread he found in a junk drawer. It looked like a jagged scar across the shoulder. Breakfast was a bruised banana and half a cup of tap water. He left a note for Mrs. Higgins on the counter next to Cherish's meticulously packed lunchbox. A plastic container holding a peanut butter sandwich and exactly 6 apple slices. The commute was brutal. The air in the subway station was thick with the smell of old grease and damp earth. Every time a train rumbled past, vibrating through the concrete soles of his boots, Anthony's stomach clenched. A phantom rush of air, a flash of headlights. The memory of the woman's wet, ragged gasp for air played on a loop in his exhausted brain. He kept his back pressed firmly against the tiled wall until his train arrived. By noon he was at his first job. The distribution warehouse smelled of damp, corrugated cardboard and diesel fumes from the idling delivery trucks. Anthony's job was simple, mindless, and physically punishing move. Heavy boxes from pallet A to pallet B. Every lift was a negotiation with his bruised body. The coarse cardboard scraped against his raw knuckles. By his lunch break, he was sweating through his thermal shirt, the moisture chilling his skin the moment he stopped moving. His supervisor, a heavy-set man who constantly chewed on a frayed toothpick, docked him 15 minutes of pay because he took too long carrying a shipment of industrial solvents. Anthony didn't argue. He just swallowed the frustration. It tasted like old pennies. Miles away, crisp, high-thread count linen chafed against Cassandra Pierce's skin. She despised hospitals. The private suite at Mount Sinai smelled faintly of rubbing alcohol and the obscenely large arrangement of white orchids her board of directors had sent. Cassandra sat perfectly upright in the adjustable bed, glaring at the IV tube taped to the back of her pale hand. The anaphylactic shock had nearly killed her. She knew that. Her throat still felt bruised raw from the violent intake of oxygen after the EpiPen jab. But the near-death experience wasn't what kept her jaw clenched tight enough to give her a migraine. It was the utter loss of control. Her custom $40,000 motorized wheelchair, engineered specifically for her spinal cord injury, with an ultra-light carbon fiber frame and precision controls, was currently a twisted pile of scrap metal in a police impound lot. She hated being vulnerable. She had spent the last 8 years, ever since the accident that took her legs, building an impenetrable fortress around herself. She was the CEO of Pierce Industries. She commanded rooms. She didn't lie convulsing on filthy subway tiles. "I want to name Hayes." Cassandra's voice was raspy, stripped of its usual smooth, authoritative cadence. She looked toward the corner of the room. Hayes, her head of security, stepped out of the shadows. He was a broad-shouldered man in a charcoal suit, holding a sleek tablet. He approached the bed, his expression neutral. "We pulled the transit authority feeds," Hayes said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He handed her the tablet. Facial recognition got a hit off a turnstile camera. Anthony Bowen, 32, no criminal record. Works 2 jobs, a warehouse in Queens and a diner in the village. From his credit history, or lack thereof, he's barely scraping by. Cassandra stared at the paused frame on the screen. It was a grainy shot of Anthony pushing through a turnstile. His hair was messy, his shoulders slumped beneath a cheap, bulky coat. He looked worn down to the bone. She swiped to the next file, the platform footage. She watched detached as the heavy train bore down on her. She watched the man Anthony sprint forward without hesitation. He tackled her. He took the brunt of the fall on the hard concrete. He jammed the injector into her leg, and then he simply walked away. That was the detail that gnawed at her. People didn't just walk away from Cassandra Pierce. They wanted things: money, favors, access. This man had saved her life, picked up his cheap duffel bag, and disappeared into the crowd before the paramedics even arrived. It defied every cynical rule of human nature she had built her empire upon. "I want to see him," Cassandra said, tossing the tablet onto the foot of the bed. Hayes frowned slightly. "Ms. Pierce, your doctors advise at least another 24 hours of observation. The residual effects of the... I am not asking for medical advice." Hayes, Cassandra snapped the cold edge returning to her voice. "Find out where his next shift is. Get me a chair. A temporary one, whatever they have downstairs. We're leaving." Ammonia and burnt sugar. The diner's kitchen was a sensory assault. Anthony stood over the deep industrial sink, his hands submerged in scalding, cloudy water. The skin on his fingers was heavily pruned, pale, and cracking at the joints. He scrubbed a wire pad against the scorched bottom of an aluminum skillet, the rhythmic shh sound barely cutting through the clatter of plates and the hiss of the deep fryer behind him. The air in the kitchen was stagnant, thick with vaporized grease that coated everything: the walls, the floor, his skin. His shoulder throbbed with a relentless, heavy pulse. It was 3:45 p.m. He had 4 more hours until he could take off the stained apron, pick up Cherish, and collapse. "Bowen!" Anthony flinched as the swinging metal door to the dining room banged open. Sal, the diner's manager, stuck his balding head into the steamy kitchen. He looked agitated. "Someone's here for you," Sal barked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Up front." Anthony stopped scrubbing. He let the skillet sink to the bottom of the murky water. "I don't have time for a break, Sal. The bus tubs are backing up." "I don't care," Sal hissed, his eyes wide. "Go, now, and don't drip on the linoleum." Anthony grabbed a rough towel, dried his hands, and pushed through the swinging door. The diner was mostly empty in the mid-afternoon lull. The smell of stale coffee and bleach hung in the air. He stopped in his tracks. Standing by the pie display case was a man who clearly did not belong in a place where coffee cost $1.50. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, the fabric catching the harsh fluorescent light. He stood with a stiff, military posture. Anthony walked forward slowly, his boots sticking slightly to the greasy floor. "Can I help you?" Hayes turned his dark eyes, sweeping over Anthony, taking in the stained apron, the dark circles under his eyes, the crude stitches on the shoulder of the coat hanging on a nearby peg. "Anthony Bowen?" Hayes asked. "Who's asking?" Anthony replied, his voice flat. His defensive instincts flared. Men in suits only brought bad news. Eviction notices, debt collection court summons. Hayes reached inside his jacket. Anthony tensed, but the man only produced a thick, crisp white envelope. He held it out. "I represent the family of the woman you assisted at the West 4th Street station yesterday," Hayes said smoothly. "Ms. Pierce wishes to express her profound gratitude for your quick actions. This is a token of her appreciation." Anthony stared at the envelope. It was thick, substantial. His mind instantly calculated what might be inside. Rent, groceries, a new winter coat for Cherish. It would be so easy to take it, but he remembered the woman's eyes on the platform, the raw terror, and he remembered how he had left her there, shivering and alone, because he was too afraid of the complications. The memory left a sour, shameful taste in his mouth. He didn't deserve a reward. He had acted on instinct, then acted out of cowardice. "I don't want it," Anthony said, crossing his arms over his chest. His bruised ribs screamed in protest, but he kept his face impassive. Hayes looked genuinely surprised. The envelope hovered in the air between them. "Mr. Bowen, I don't think you understand. This is a substantial sum. It's meant to cover any inconvenience." "I said I don't want it," Anthony interrupted, his tone hardening. "I didn't do it for a payout. I did it because she was going to get hit by a train. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have 50 plates crusting over in the back." He turned to walk away. The heavy glass door of the diner chimed loudly, swinging open. A mechanical hum, a pitch higher and more strained than the smooth purr of her previous chair, drifted into the room. Anthony turned back. Cassandra Pierce maneuvered a clunky, standard-issue hospital power chair through the doorway. She looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of cracked red vinyl booths and sticky tables. She was wearing a sharp charcoal blazer over a simple black turtleneck, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, sleek knot. She was pale, the blue veins stark against the skin of her neck, but her hazel eyes were locked onto Anthony with an intensity that made him want to take a step back. She rolled the chair to a stop next to Hayes. The silence in the diner was sudden and heavy. Even Sal had stopped wiping down the counter, staring openly. "You're a very difficult man to track down, Mr. Bowen," Cassandra said. Her voice was slightly raspy, lacking the full volume it normally carried, but it still commanded the room. Anthony looked from her to Hayes, then back to her. He noted the heavy, dark circles under her eyes, mirroring his own. "You should be in a hospital," Anthony said bluntly. "And you should take the money," Cassandra countered, not missing a beat. "It's $50,000, clean untaxed. It clears your debts. It pays your rent. Why are you being stubborn?" Anthony felt a hot spike of anger cut through his exhaustion. $50,000. She threw the number out like it was spare change. She had investigated him, looked into his debts. The violation felt intimate and gross, because rich people don't hand out envelopes without wanting a receipt. Anthony said, his voice dropping to a low, rough pitch. He stepped closer, leaning down slightly, ignoring the flare of pain in his side. You think because you looked up my credit score you know me. You think slipping me cash erases whatever guilt you have about almost dying in the dirt with the rest of us." Cassandra flinched. It was a minuscule movement, a tightening of the jaw, but Anthony saw it. "I'm not selling anything," she said, her voice dropping the authoritative edge, sounding suddenly strained. "I owe you my life." "You don't owe me anything," Anthony snapped back, turning away. He pushed hard against the swinging metal door to the kitchen. "Don't come back here. The grease is bad for the silk." The door swung shut behind him, cutting off the view of the billionaire in the cheap chair, but leaving the heavy scent of her expensive perfume lingering over the smell of ammonia and burnt sugar. Coughing hacked through the thin drywall of the studio apartment, a dry, ragged sound that made Anthony's chest tight. It was 2:14 a.m. He had been asleep for exactly 40 minutes, his exhausted body sinking like a stone into the lumpy mattress before the sound dragged him back to consciousness. He threw off the thin quilt. The floorboards were freezing against his bare feet. He crossed the 4 steps to the curtained-off corner and pulled the fabric back. Cherish was curled into a tight ball beneath her faded dinosaur blanket. She wasn't just coughing, she was whimpering a small, continuous sound of pure misery. Anthony knelt beside her, resting his calloused palm against her forehead. She was burning. It felt like touching a radiator pipe, panic icy and sharp, spiked through his veins. He didn't have a thermometer. He didn't need one. He knew the difference between a mild sniffle and a dangerous fever. Her breathing was shallow, catching in her throat with a frightening rasp. "Hey, monkey," Anthony whispered, his voice trembling. He stroked her damp, matted curls. "Daddy's here." She didn't open her eyes. She just let out another weak, rattling cough that shook her tiny frame. Anthony scrambled to his feet. He opened the dented medicine cabinet above the bathroom sink. The hinges screeched. He poured past a half-empty bottle of aftershave and a rusty razor, his fingers closing around the sticky plastic bottle of children's ibuprofen. He held it up to the harsh overhead light. Empty. A crust of dried pink liquid coated the bottom, mocking him. He moved to the kitchenette, opening the drawer where he kept his cash tips. $3 bills and a handful of quarters stared back at him. Tomorrow was payday, but tomorrow was hours away. He needed an all-night pharmacy. He needed an urgent care clinic. He needed money he simply did not possess. His eyes darted to the worn canvas apron draped over the back of the dining chair. When he had stormed out of the diner's front room earlier that afternoon, Sal had shoved something into his pocket. Anthony crossed the room, his hands shaking as he dug into the grease-stained fabric. He pulled out a crisp, heavy rectangle of cream-colored cardstock. The embossed silver lettering caught the dim light from the street lamp outside. Hayes, Director of Security, Pierce Industries. A direct cell phone number was printed beneath it. Anthony stared at the card. He thought about the thick white envelope sitting on the diner counter. $50,000. He had walked away from it because he wanted to keep his dignity intact. He had looked a billionaire in the eye and told her he wasn't for sale. He had felt righteous. He had felt strong. He looked back at the curtained corner, listening to the terrible wet sound of his daughter struggling to pull air into her lungs. Pride was a luxury for people who had health insurance. 40 minutes later, Anthony stood under the buzzing, sterile lights of a 24-hour pharmacy in a bleak strip mall 10 blocks from his apartment. He shifted his weight, trying not to jostle Cherish, who was wrapped in a heavy blanket and slumped against his chest. Her skin was unnaturally flushed, radiating heat through his thin t-shirt. She felt incredibly heavy, a dead weight against his bruised ribs. "That'll be $142 for the consultation and the amoxicillin," the pharmacist said. He was a young man with tired eyes, entirely indifferent to the desperation radiating from Anthony. He tapped a manicured fingernail against the cash register. "Insurance card." "I don't have it," Anthony rasped. He adjusted his grip on Cherish, his right shoulder, screaming in agony. Can you bill me? I get paid tomorrow. I swear to you, I'll bring the cash at 6 a.m. The pharmacist let out a long, practiced sigh. "I can't do that, sir. Store policy. Payment at the time of service. I can put the antibiotics back on the shelf if you need to go find an ATM." Anthony's jaw clenched so hard, his teeth ground together. The muscles in his neck strained. He looked at the small white paper bag sitting on the counter, mere inches from his fingertips. It held the medicine his daughter desperately needed to fight off the severe ear infection and strep throat the late-night clinic doctor had just diagnosed. It was right there. He shifted Cherish into his left arm, ignoring the white-hot flash of pain in his collarbone. With his right hand, he reached into his jeans pocket and pulled out the crisp, cream-colored card. He didn't want the $50,000. He just wanted $142. Anthony walked toward the sliding glass doors, letting the automatic sensor detect him, so the doors would part, allowing a blast of freezing night air to wash over him. He pulled out his cheap, cracked smartphone. His thumb hovered over the keypad. He felt a deep, twisting nausea in his gut. It was the death of his ego, a brutal surrender to the reality of his poverty. He dialed the number. It rang twice. "Hayes," a gruff voice answered. Anthony squeezed his eyes shut, leaning his forehead against the cold condensation-slicked glass of the pharmacy window. "It's Anthony Bowen," he said, his voice cracking, stripped of all the defiance he had worn like armor that afternoon. I need a favor." Ice clinked against the sides of a heavy crystal tumbler. Cassandra Pierce sat in the darkened living room of her penthouse. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sprawling, glittering view of the Manhattan skyline, a sea of diamonds scattered across black velvet. The silence in the room was absolute, insulated by millions of dollars of acoustic engineering. She hated it. She rolled her temporary wheelchair back from the glass, the standard rubber wheels squeaking slightly against the polished hardwood. It wasn't her chair. It was clunky, unresponsive, and painfully generic. Every time she moved, her bruised sternum ached, a sharp reminder of the concrete platform and the heavy weight of the man who had driven the breath from her lungs. She took a slow sip of her bourbon. The burn at the back of her throat grounded her. Anthony Bowen was a glitch in her perfectly calculated world. In Cassandra's reality, every interaction was a transaction. Loyalty was purchased, silence was negotiated, gratitude was quantified in thick envelopes of untraceable cash. When she offered him the money, it wasn't just a reward. It was an attempt to restore the power dynamic. She had been helpless, gasping for air on a filthy floor, while a man in a greasy coat held her life in his raw, scarred hands. Giving him a fortune was supposed to make them even. It was supposed to put her back on top. "You think slipping me cash erases whatever guilt you have about almost dying in the dirt with the rest of us?" His words echoed in the empty penthouse. He had looked at her with pure, unadulterated contempt. Not awe, not greed, pity and disgust. Her encrypted cell phone buzzed on the low marble coffee table. She glanced at the screen. It was Hayes. "Yes," she answered, her tone clipped. "Ms. Pierce, I just received a call," Hayes said. His voice lacked its usual unshakable calm. "It's Bowen." Cassandra sat up straighter, wincing as the movement pulled at her abdominal muscles. A small cynical part of her brain whispered, "I told you so. They always come back for the money." "Did he give you an account number to wire the funds?" she asked, setting the tumbler down. "No, ma'am." Hayes replied, a strange hesitation in his voice. "He didn't ask for the envelope. He asked for $142. He's at a 24-hour pharmacy in Queens. He said he has his daughter with him. She's severely ill, and he can't cover the prescription." Cassandra froze. The cynical voice in her head vanished, replaced by a sudden hollow dropping sensation in her chest. $142. She spent more than that on the imported coffee beans her assistant stocked in the break room. She had offered him $50,000, and he was begging for bus fare to save his child. The sheer staggering disparity of it hit her like a physical blow. "Send a car," Cassandra said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I'll have a driver bring him the cash immediately," Hayes confirmed. "No." Cassandra interrupted her grip, tightening on the armrests of the cheap chair. "Send the modified van. To me. Right now." 20 minutes later, the heavy black doors of the pharmacy slid open. Anthony was sitting on a plastic waiting chair near the blood pressure machine. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. Cherish was asleep against his chest. Her breathing labored her face, buried in his stained coat. Cassandra didn't send Hayes in first. She rolled through the doors herself. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the pharmacy was unforgiving. It highlighted the pallor of her skin and the dark, bruised circles under her eyes. She wore a heavy cashmere wrap thrown hastily over silk pajamas. She looked out of place, an exotic bird dropped into a concrete bunker. She steered the clunky chair down the aisle past the displays of cheap sunglasses and seasonal candy. The smell of the store, a chemical mixture of floor wax, old peppermint, and rubbing alcohol, made her stomach turn. Anthony watched her approach. He didn't stand up. He looked utterly defeated. The anger that had fueled him in the diner was completely gone, burned away by fear and exhaustion. Cassandra stopped the chair a few feet from him. She didn't speak. She looked at the small, flushed face of the little girl tucked under his chin. She saw the way Anthony held her fiercely protective, despite his visible exhaustion. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a sleek black titanium credit card, and silently handed it to the pharmacist behind the counter. "Process whatever he needs." Cassandra told the young man, her voice lacking its usual commanding volume, sounding instead quiet and terribly raw. "And any back balances, anything." The pharmacist, eyes wide at the sight of the heavy metal card, scrambled to the register. He swiped it, handed over a receipt to sign, and slid the white paper bag across the counter. Cassandra took the bag. She turned her chair and rolled back over to Anthony. She held the medicine out to him. Anthony hesitated. His jaw tightened. He looked at the bag, then up at her face. He was expecting a lecture. He was expecting a look of triumph, a smug confirmation that she had won, that he needed her after all. He didn't find it. Cassandra's hazel eyes were stripped of their corporate armor. They looked tired, apologetic, and profoundly sad. "I was wrong," Cassandra said softly, the words catching slightly in her throat. The admission felt unnatural, like speaking a foreign language. "At the diner, I treated you like a problem to be managed. I treated you like a line item." Anthony slowly reached out and took the bag. His fingers brushed against hers. His skin was rough-scarred from hot water and lifting boxes. Hers was cool and smooth. "I shouldn't have been so proud," Anthony muttered, his voice thick. He looked down at Cherish, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. It almost cost her. "You were protecting your dignity," Cassandra replied, her gaze fixed on the little girl. "I tried to buy it from you. We were both stupid." Anthony let out a harsh, brief sound that might have been a laugh if it weren't so choked with exhaustion. He carefully tucked the paper bag into the pocket of his torn coat. "Thank you," he said, simply. The words were heavy, devoid of resentment, just an honest, grounded acknowledgement of a debt incurred. "My driver is outside," Cassandra said, gesturing toward the sliding doors. "He'll take you home. It's too cold for her to be on the subway." Anthony didn't argue. He carefully stood up, grunting as his bruised ribs shifted under Cherish's weight. He walked toward the exit, pausing just as the automatic doors parted. He looked back over his shoulder at the billionaire sitting in the cheap hospital chair beneath the flickering fluorescent lights. The invisible wall between them, built of pride cash and social strata, had cracked wide open, and neither of them knew how to repair it. Chalky artificial cherry syrup clung to the rim of the plastic measuring spoon. Anthony kept his hand steady, letting the thick pink liquid slide over Cherish's lower lip. She swallowed reflexively, her small face scrunching up in distaste before relaxing back into the pillow. Morning light, the color of dirty dishwater, filtered through the cheap plastic blinds. The apartment was suffocatingly hot, the radiator hissing its relentless metallic tune. But when Anthony pressed the back of his hand to Cherish's forehead, the terrifying heat of the previous night had receded into a mild, damp warmth. She was breathing evenly. The rattle in her chest was gone. Anthony slumped back onto the linoleum floor, resting his head against the edge of her mattress. His entire body ached with a deep, vibrating exhaustion. The bruise on his ribs had blossomed into a horrific tapestry of yellow and deep violet. He closed his eyes, listening to the rhythmic, comforting sound of his daughter drawing air. Then his cheap smartphone vibrated violently against the floorboards. He snatched it up before it could wake her, staring at the cracked screen. It was a number he recognized. The warehouse manager. Anthony swiped the green icon, bringing the phone to his ear. "I know I missed the shift, Gary," Anthony whispered, keeping his voice tight and low. "My kid was in the emergency clinic. I can bring the paperwork." "Save the paper, Bowen." Gary's voice rasped through the terrible speaker, sounding like he was chewing gravel. "It's a no-call, no-show. You know the policy. Corporate doesn't care about your kid's throat. Box kickers are a dime a dozen. Don't bother coming in." The line went dead. A sharp electronic click, and then nothing. Anthony slowly lowered the phone. His stomach dropped, hitting the floor with a sickening thud. The math instantly rearranged itself in his head, a cruel, relentless algorithm of poverty. The warehouse job was his rent. The diner job was food and electricity. Half his survival severed in a 10-second phone call. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes until sparks danced in his vision. The $142 of medicine sitting on the counter had saved his daughter, but the fallout of the last 48 hours had dismantled his life. He had played the hero, and this was the invoice. Across the city, a very different kind of quiet settled over a sprawling penthouse, fresh, sharp leather and industrial lubricant. That was what the new wheelchair smelled like. It was a top-of-the-line loaner, sleek and responsive, delivered by a terrified medical supply executive at 6 in the morning. Cassandra sat in it, her fingers resting lightly on the matte black joystick. It moved smoothly, a whisper, quiet hum gliding over the imported Persian rugs. It wasn't her chair. It felt foreign and intrusive. She rolled toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. The trees were bare, skeletal fingers scratching at the grey sky. She held a porcelain cup of black coffee, the heat seeping into her cold palms. Hayes stood near the mahogany dining table, his posture rigidly professional. He had just finished a quiet, concise briefing. Cassandra took a slow sip of the bitter brew. "Fired." "Yes, ma'am." Hayes replied, his voice neutral. I ran a routine follow-up on his employment status this morning, given the late-night pharmacy incident. The logistics firm terminated him for absence. Cassandra gripped the armrest. A knot of anger, dense and jagged, formed beneath her ribs. It wasn't directed at the faceless warehouse manager. It was directed at the fragile, absurd system that allowed a man to be crushed simply because his child fell ill. And deeper down, it was directed at herself. She had offered him $50,000 to wash her hands of him, to clean her conscience. When he refused, she had felt insulted. She hadn't understood that the envelope of cash was an insult to a man who took pride in the brutal, grinding labor that kept a roof over his daughter's head. He didn't want a lottery ticket. He just wanted to stand on his own 2 feet. And now, indirectly because of her, the ground had been cut out from under him. "Cancel my 10 o'clock board meeting," Cassandra said, turning the chair away from the window, "and tell the driver to bring the modified van back around." Hayes frowned slightly, a rare break in his stoic facade. "Ms. Pierce, your physician, explicitly stated, 'I don't care.'" Cassandra cut him off her tone, leaving no room for negotiation. She set the porcelain cup down with a sharp clatter. "We're going to Queens." Grease-coated cables ground against rusted iron gears, producing a mechanical shriek that made Cassandra's teeth ache. The freight elevator of Anthony's apartment building was a metal cage that smelled of wet plaster bleach and decades of spilled garbage. She hated it. The vibrations creeping up through the wheels of her chair mirrored the violent shaking of the subway platform. Her chest tightened, phantom panic restricting her airway. She forced herself to breathe in slowly through her nose, gripping the armrests until her knuckles turned white. Hayes stood beside her, watching the exposed brick wall slide downward. He hadn't tried to stop her from coming up, recognizing the dangerous, stubborn set of her jaw. The elevator slammed to a halt on the 4th floor with a heavy metallic shudder. Hayes pulled the heavy grate open. Cassandra rolled out into the dim hallway. The carpet beneath her wheels was thin and permanently stained, exhaling a scent of old cooking oil and damp wool. She navigated around a rusted bicycle chained to a radiator and stopped in front of door 4B. The paint around the knob was chipped, exposing layers of cheap yellow and green from decades past. She didn't wait for Hayes to do it. She raised her fist and knocked. Heavy, uneven footsteps approached from the other side. The deadbolt clicked loudly. The door swung inward. Anthony froze. He was wearing a faded grey sweatshirt, the collar stretched and fraying. His dark hair stood up in chaotic angles, and the bruise on his jaw was now a striking, sickly yellow. He held a needle and a spool of thick black thread in his left hand. He stared at the billionaire in the hallway, his eyes dropping to the sleek new wheelchair, then back up to her face. "You've got to be kidding me." Anthony muttered, his voice gravelly with sleep and stress. He didn't open the door wider. "May I come in, Mr. Bowen?" Cassandra asked, her voice steady, stripping away the corporate authority and leaving only a quiet insistence. Anthony looked past her to the hulking figure of Hayes. He let out a harsh, defeated breath, stepping back and pulling the door open. "Careful. The floorboards near the threshold are warped. Don't get stuck." Cassandra maneuvered over the uneven wood rolling into the tiny apartment. It was brutally small. She took in the peeling paint, the ancient radiator, the curtain drawn across one corner. But it was meticulously clean. The faint smell of chalky cherry medicine hung in the air over the scent of harsh lemon floor cleaner. "My kid is sleeping," Anthony said softly, closing the door behind Hayes, who remained positioned like a sentinel near the entrance. "Keep it quiet." Cassandra stopped in the center of the room. She looked at the heavy canvas winter coat draped over a wobbly kitchen chair. Anthony had been in the middle of sewing up the massive tear on the shoulder. The stitches were thick, ugly, and utilitarian. "You lost your job," Cassandra stated. No preamble, no polite evasion. Anthony stiffened. He walked over to the kitchen counter, tossing the needle and thread down next to a stack of past due bills. "Your security guy has a creepy hobby of stalking dishwashers." "I asked him to check," Cassandra corrected gently. She watched the tension coil in his shoulders. "You missed your shift because of the emergency clinic, because of the subway incident. I missed my shift because I didn't clock in." Anthony snapped, turning to face her, his hands gripping the edge of the chipped Formica counter. "That's how the world works down here, Ms. Pierce. You don't show up, you don't eat. It's not your fault. It's not your problem." "It became my problem the moment you tackled me off that platform." Cassandra fired back, her own frustration rising, cutting through her practiced calm. "You shattered my chair, you cracked my ribs, and you saved my life. Our ledgers are permanently tied, Anthony. Stop pretending they aren't." Anthony flinched at the use of his first name. He stared at her, the dark, exhausted circles under his eyes contrasting with the sudden flare of defensive anger. "What do you want? You want to write me a check so you can sleep better in your penthouse? I told you." "I don't want to write you a check," Cassandra interrupted her voice, dropping to a low, fierce murmur. She leaned forward in her chair. "I know you wouldn't cash it anyway. You're too damn proud to accept a lifeline. It's not pride, it's survival." Anthony countered, his voice raw. "Handouts make you soft. They make you dependent. The second the money dries up, you're worse off than before because you forgot how to scrape by." Cassandra held his gaze. The air between them felt heavy, charged with the friction of two entirely different universes colliding in a 400-square-foot room. "Then I'm not offering a handout," Cassandra said softly. "I'm offering a trade." Anthony narrowed his eyes, suspicious. "A trade for what?" "Pierce Industries runs one of the largest logistics networks on the eastern seaboard," Cassandra said, shifting into the cadence of a CEO, but keeping her tone grounded. "My warehouse managers are idiots with business degrees who don't know the difference between a pallet jack and a forklift. They look at spreadsheets, not people. Their turnover rate is 40%, and it's bleeding my bottom line." She gestured toward the scarred knuckles gripping the counter. "You know how the floor operates. You know the exact breaking point of a worker on a 14-hour shift. I don't need another suit in management. I need someone who knows the actual weight of the boxes." Anthony was silent. He let go of the counter, crossing his arms over his chest, his thumb absent-mindedly rubbing the edge of his frayed sweatshirt. "You want to hire me?" Anthony said, slowly tasting the words. "A guy with no degree who just got fired for a no-call, no-show." "I want to hire a man who throws himself in front of a train for a stranger and then refuses $50,000 to keep his dignity intact," Cassandra corrected. "I need that kind of stubborn grit on my payroll. It pays union-scale full benefits and health insurance that actually covers amoxicillin without bankrupting you." Anthony looked away, his gaze drifting to the faded curtain hiding his daughter. The silence stretched, filled only by the hiss of the radiator and the distant wail of a police siren. He swallowed hard. The internal war was visible on his face, the desperate need to protect his child, fighting against his deep-seated distrust of charity. But this wasn't charity. It was a job. It was a brutally difficult job in a corporate machine. But it was real work. He looked back at Cassandra. She wasn't pitying him. She was looking at him with hard, uncompromising respect. "If I take it," Anthony said, his voice dropping an octave thick with emotion he refused to shed. "I earn it. You don't fast-track me. You don't give me special treatment. I screw up, you fire me. Cassandra's lips twitched in the ghost of a smile. "Anthony, if you screw up, I will personally come down to the loading dock and fire you myself." A long exhale shuddered through Anthony's chest. The tension that had held his bones together for the last 48 hours finally snapped. He slumped slightly, leaning his hip against the counter. He looked at the sleek, expensive wheelchair, and then at the woman sitting in it, recognizing the shared raw humanity beneath the cashmere. "I have cheap coffee," Anthony muttered, gesturing vaguely toward the rusted drip machine on the counter. "It tastes like burnt copper. Pour it," Cassandra said, leaning back in her chair. Hayes stepped silently toward the door, turning the deadbolt to ensure their privacy, before resuming his post. Anthony reached for two mismatched ceramic mugs. The porcelain clinked against the counter, a small grounding sound in the quiet apartment. They weren't friends. They were miles apart in every way that mattered to the outside world. But in the dim light of the tiny kitchen, surrounded by peeling paint and the smell of old linoleum, they had finally found level ground. Anthony and Cassandra proved that sometimes the biggest collisions in life don't break us. They build a bridge between two entirely different worlds. Did Anthony make the right call by refusing the money but taking the job? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If this gritty, emotional journey kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a story about resilience and real human connection. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more deeply grounded, powerful audio dramas.